It's an exciting time for the pork industry. I think, as Secretary Perdue said last week at the World Meat Congress, free and fair trade are really going to be the key to U.S. agriculture's success. Certainly during this period of expansion that we're having in the U.S. pork industry, international markets are absolutely critical. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is what we're doing at the National Pork Board to leverage producer dollars to make sure that we have the best chance of remaining profitable during this period and really coming out on the other end is not only the major global player in the world pork industry, but one obviously that keeps U.S. producers here at home profitable. A big part of that is our partnership with the National Pork Producers Council, and Courtney is here with us, and that's obviously a real key part of our strategy. What we do at the board is everything we can in those markets that we have access to maximize our opportunities. And then obviously the entire industry depends on the council to do everything they can to make sure that the markets that we either have restricted or limited or no access to are open to you during this period. So it's a true partnership. I'm going to talk about really some of the pork board's efforts. I won't talk about, as I normally do, a lot of the trade data. Dermot, who is the economist for our National Pork Board's International Marketing Committee, he's going to go through all of that with you after my talk. We had an amazing set of trade data that just came out for the April set, which is the most recent set, and he's going to go through that and kind of talk about some of the predictions for the year ahead. But let me get started. Obviously, exports are very important to the U.S. pork industry. I think you can debate how important exports are to U.S. producers, but what you can never debate is that they're more important today than they've ever been. As an industry in the mid-'80s, we got about less than $2 per head coming from the value of pork and pork variety meat exports. It wasn't until 1995 that we became a net exporter, and last year we accounted for fully 31% of the global pork export trade, and that brought home to producers some $53.47 per head. So clearly it is now an integral part of our industry. It is integral to U.S. producer returns, integral to U.S. profitability, and honestly is the only way that we're going to get through this period of expansion is by maximizing our footprint in the international market. And one of the things in the National Pork Board that we've done unbelievably well is build demand for pork here at home, keep that on-farm production research and all the other things that we've done historically for the Pork Board. But I think now is truly a recognition by NPB that we need the same sort of priority in our international marketing strategy. Last year, we were the number 2 exporter of pork in the world, behind only the entire European Union. As I said, we accounted for fully 31% of all the pork that really crossed borders. That's a real testament to the U.S. industry, and something that I think if you walk away with anything knowing we should be really proud of that accomplishment, given that we are only about 10% of world production, and about 91% of the pork consumed in the world is consumed off our shores. And so us having such a dramatic footprint is really a testament to the power of the U.S. pork industry and something that we're taking very serious. 2017, if you didn't get the memo, and we've got handouts that kind of go through some of these infographics, was a record year for the U.S. pork industry. As I had mentioned earlier, fully almost 27%, 26.2% of U.S. pork and pork variety meat production was exported last year. That is an astounding number, and it is one that should give us all a little bit of pause because that means that U.S. pork is more dependent on exports than any other livestock commodity by a far margin. And that's one of the reasons that the Council is so focused on issues related to trade with the tariffs and things that are in the news today. That's why that's so important to the U.S. pork industry. We are truly dependent on these export markets. If you look at where our pork goes around the world, there's 2 ways you can cut the data. One's by value, one's by volume. By volume, our largest market is by far and away Mexico. They take roughly 40% of the hams off of our hogs today and about 7% of U.S. production. But by value, it's Japan. And that's one of the reasons that in a minute you're going to see a large percentage of our marketing budget goes into the Japanese market. Japan is by far and away the most profitable export market for, frankly, the world in what's called the chilled loin market. They have a thing called a gate price system that essentially establishes a price for loins in Japan that is far beyond the price for loins anywhere else in the world. And if you talk to any packer in the United States, they will talk about volumes exported is very important, but the value of those exports that they really bring back to their bottom line, Japan is absolutely critical. And so if you take that 53.47, you'll see how that divides out on a value basis, with Japan bringing fully $13.40 for exports. Some other big numbers for you to remember. Last year, again, was a record year for us. 5.39 billion pounds of pork and pork variety meat exported. That is by far and away an export record for the United States. The value of that 5.39 billion pounds was fully $6.48 billion. That's an amazing testament to this industry. We are overwhelmingly a net exporter by value and volume for pork. And it's something that has made this industry somewhat vulnerable to some of the trade issues that the council is working on so hard. When you start looking at a carcass, we eat a lot of bellies here. We eat a lot of ribs here. We don't eat near the number of variety meat products that our hogs produce. And so variety meats are something that are a huge priority for us to export because their value in export markets is far beyond that it is here at home. I like to say I love Braunschweiger. I really do. But I can't eat enough of it, frankly, to keep the U.S. industry profitable. So if you look at the export markets, fully 82% of all the variety meats that we produce in the United States go into export markets, and overwhelmingly those go into China, and that's one of the reasons that China is so important to us. Variety meats were one of the big stars for last year. As I said, there were $6.48 billion in U.S. pork and pork variety meat exports. Of that $6.48 billion, we had never as an industry approached $1 billion coming from exports. And we blew by that speed of sound number with fully $1.17 billion of export value coming back from variety meats. And so variety meats are very important to us, and that is overwhelmingly a product that's going into China. So as I talked about a minute ago with that $53.47 coming from exports, fully $6 of that came from the value of our variety meat exports just to China. So that's one of the reasons that market is so critically important to us. We can get around $1.15 a pound for products in China that we can only get about 5 to 15 cents a pound here at home for. And that's a true residual value issue that we have to deal with, and making sure that very important market to us stays that way. 2017, I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical stuff just briefly. I do want you to see that last year was a challenging year already, even before the trade issue started in China. China has actually an overproduction issue. They have rapidly expanded their hog herd. That expansion has frankly made their need for imports less. That's one of the reasons that the tariffs that they placed on us was very convenient for them. It certainly sent a signal to our industry at a time that we did not need that signal, but at the same time, it was a way that they could exert a little bit of pain on us without having a little bit of pain inflicted on themselves. But one of the reasons I like to show this slide is last year, as I said, was an absolutely record export year for the United States on a volume basis, but it was also a year that we had a huge reduction in the volume of our exports to China. And that's one of the reasons that at the Pork Board, we're very focused on what we're calling a diversification strategy, or I've coined a not all of our bacon in one basket strategy. It's important that we make sure that we have pork flowing into a number of different markets at any one time, so that when we do have challenges in an overproduction situation like China, or as we're dealing this year in trade issues with China and Mexico, that we have that diversification to depend upon. Because as I said, to manage the producer risk, we have to make sure that when these issues pop up, we have other markets available to us. If you really look at where the United States exports to on a world map, it's really a testament to that diversification strategy. As you can see here on a value basis, it jumps from the Eastern Hemisphere with Japan to the Western Hemisphere with Mexico, back to the Eastern Hemisphere with China, back to the Western Hemisphere with Canada. It literally goes back and forth. And I think that's something you should really take a lot of confidence in, that we've worked really hard with our partners at the National Pork Producers Council and U.S. Meat Export Federation to make sure that we have that diversification so that when we do have challenges in any one market, that we can withstand those. Globally, so this is not just the United States, global pork exports to different markets. This really shows you a very telling slide. This is in really graphical form that normally you would truncate because it makes all the other bars on this graph look small. China just imported a lot less pork last year, as I said, because They are the largest pork producing country, largest pork consuming country. As a percentage of consumption, imports are actually pretty small. And last year they imported a lot less pork than they have in years past. And why that's really important is we weren't so dependent on that market as other countries were. Europe really suffered a 1-2 punch. Europe had been very dependent on the Russian market. They lost that market because of the Crimea situation. Then they swooped into China and did very well in China. And then last year, when China frankly just didn't eat as much pork, period, Europe really felt that. We were down 9%, as I showed before, but we were able to withstand that because of our growth in markets like South America, Central America, Caribbean, ASEAN, and then obviously around the world. By market, we talk a lot about diversification, and we talk a lot about expansion of exports. It's impossible to have that conversation without recognizing the importance of Mexico. Mexico accounts for, over this time frame, the last 10 years, roughly 56% of the export growth that we've enjoyed. So Mexico, we've talked a lot about our ability to put more product into more markets. Mexico has really been a great partner for the United States in that. And so it is impossible for us to discuss on a volume basis our growth without recognizing the importance of the Mexico market. There are trend lines up on this graph, but as you can see, Mexico is the one that has pretty consistently gone up. So current events, what's going on in the international marketing key in this challenging trade environment that we are all aware of. As we know, China has the 25% tariff. That is our third largest international market by value for U.S. pork. And in 2017, we had about 1.1 billion. And again, that's very critical to those variety meats, a product that has a residual value here at home, very low. Current situation in China, as we kind of look through, China is a market that obviously has presented some challenges in the pork sector. Beef has had some positive gains, and then obviously poultry has had some challenges as well. New Mexico situation, have to at least make reference to what happened. We now, through July 5, are in a 10% tariff situation that then, if not resolved by July 5, could tick up to 20%. That affects, obviously, our primary product that we ship into that market, the green hams or the bone-in hams that go into there, but then basically all carcass components, if disassembled from the carcass, besides whole carcasses and variety meats. Value of exports to Mexico, just to give you the value, in 2017, as I had said, Japan was our leading value market. Mexico, though, accounted for some $12.50, clearly a quarter of the total value of U.S. pork exports, so a very important market for us. In 2018, so far, huge numbers that we've put out in our talking points to the trade and making sure that everybody understands how valuable that market is to the U.S. industry. So far this year, they're fully a third of all the pork and pork variety meat volume and over a fifth of the value of our exports. So very, very important in terms of tonnage. And again, that speaks to our desire as we deploy the pork checkoff resources into international marketing to always pursue that diversification strategy, not having all of our bacon in one basket. Elevating international marketing is really one of our 4 key pillars this year that we'll talk about. And in elevating international marketing, we're talking about taking a more strategic view to our international marketing efforts. One part of that was renaming our historic, what we called trade committee, which was a large group of producers that were very interested in trade issues, and really developing a much smaller, more consolidated committee of industry leaders that would take the fiduciary responsibility to direct our increased investment in international marketing very seriously and deploy that in markets that frankly would in the long term give producers the greatest return on their investment. We also, the board, and Gary's a part of that, have invested in them to provide them the resources they need to travel around the world, not only meet with our customers of today, but better understand those markets that we're going to choose to invest in for tomorrow. So it's a real honor to work with them. This is the group. There are 11 voting members, and then Dermot and I work for them basically as staff. But it includes representatives from some of the largest pork producing and pork processing companies in the world. And it's a real honor to serve with them. They last week made a decision to encourage the board to look at even further increased investment in our international marketing efforts. But these are true individuals that are truly great individuals that's an honor to work for. And if you know any of them or run into them here during Expo, be sure to tell them thank you, because they're spending a lot of their time right now studying the international markets and helping advise us on, frankly, the best way to deploy our resources. Our role, so we're really looking at a number of different factors in terms of driving international marketing. First, learning what our international customers want and work to deliver. I had a call with a packer earlier today that's trying to better understand consumer purchasing drivers in the Japanese market, asking us for our interest in potentially assisting them with that research, working directly as in that case with producers and processors to make sure that as we get that kind of research information that tells us what the drivers are in different markets, how can they deploy that to make U.S. pork more competitive? And then finally leverage our strategic partners. And again, that's primarily the National Pork Producers Council and the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Truly that leveraging the partnership between the three organizations is going to be key to our success moving forward, making sure each of the three organizations understands their lanes and making sure that we're doing everything we can as efficiently as possible so that each leg of the stool is really firing on all cylinders. International market promotion, development, and research. This is primarily our partnership with USMEF. Pork checkoff dollars for international marketing go more into USMEF than any one bucket. They have 13 different regions around the world, and we work with them to make sure that they're deploying our resources as uniquely as possible in those markets to really promote the products that we need to move into those different markets. As I pointed out, Mexico is a huge market for our hams. Korea is a huge market for our shoulders. Japan, as I pointed out, because of the gate price system, is a massively valuable market for our loins. And then China, obviously, is a variety meat market as well. Those efforts that we've been working on with USMEF to place U.S. pork very prominently with the buyers and even the consumers has really resulted in some breathtaking things from a true even dietary pattern perspective. If you look at Mexico and much of Latin America, we have actually observed a true dietary pattern shift towards consuming more pork. Obviously, with U.S. pork's competitiveness, we're doing everything we can that as these consumers desire more pork, it's U.S. pork that's placed as competitively as possible. In terms of our investment, this is a year-over-year, 17 to 18. As you can see, we do enjoy a pretty wide berth in terms of where our money goes. Overwhelmingly, our investment currently is in the China market. As I said, it's a very profitable market. 37.7% of our marketing budget goes into the China market. That is because, at least in the near term, that is a unbelievably valuable market. That is a market, though, that in the years out, just because of demographic factors, the population will be declining. It'll be an older population. There's no reasonable expectation that Japan in the future will be as valuable to us as the growth markets have been in Mexico, Central America, South America, and other areas. So we're gradually going to see a shift from markets like Japan to other parts of the world, at least on a percentage basis, so that we make sure that we're investing checkoff dollars as strategically as possible to make sure that those growth markets, or at least the markets we know for tomorrow, are leveraged. By market, if you see that comparison to where our exports are, you don't see, obviously, as much diversification in the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. If we've enjoyed the most growth in our exports in Latin America, clearly Latin America is a market that's not getting quite as much of our research dollars. We meet with the U.S. Meat Export Federation regularly, and that is something I can tell you probably if I'm here a year from now, you're going to see a greater investment in that region by far and away, because those clearly are areas that are growing in population, growing in income, and clearly have a desire to eat pork. And we're going to do everything we can to position pork from the United States as competitively as possible. One of the things that we're also doing is trying to better understand the consumer there, not just so that we can market our product in foreign markets, but oftentimes people from other cultures emigrate to the United States, and we really want to understand when they come to our country, what are their drivers for pork. And so one of the things we recently did was travel to Mexico and really try to better understand why is pork consumption increasing so dramatically in that country. Because a lot of Mexicans from northern, central, and southern Mexico immigrate to the U.S., and we want to make sure that when we position pork here at home, we're positioning it in a way that has enjoyed such great success there, too. So we recently went down there, had an absolutely great trip, met with a number of very influential players in the Mexico market, up to and including some of the food writers from like Food and Wine magazine and the bloggers. And it was really interesting to spend time with them and understand how they've positioned pork and what they've observed in this really great period for pork consumption in that market. One of the things that we picked up on that was interesting is some of the publications, some 40% of the readership was actually here in the United States, even though they were Mexican publications. So really trying to leverage that, and that's really the lesson from that particular trip, is not only to continue to use our international marketing budget that we use to promote pork abroad, but use that budget in a way that we can even inform our domestic marketing strategy. So one of the examples was Mother's Day was happening when we were there, which happens on a completely different day than the Mother's Day that happens here in the United States. And when we were in the retail stores, they were doing a lot to promote pork on Mother's Day. It would be good to inform our domestic retailers that, hey, we have a Hispanic community, many of which come from Mexico. In many cases, they're looking to cook pork for Mother's Day. It would be good to know at least when that day is. So lots of different examples that we pulled back from that trip. World Meat Congress, as I referenced earlier, last week we were at the World Meat Congress. The council was there as well. It was an absolutely unbelievable event, met with a number of key stakeholders, had an opportunity to directly put producers, Gary was there as one of our producer leaders, directly in front of some of the leading buyers of our product from around the world, and then really showcase our product to them. So I'm really proud of our investment in the World Meat Congress and how we really maximize that for the U.S. producers. We had a number of opportunities in a dinner where we had some of the largest importers and a lunch for all attendees where we really showcased U.S. pork products that we export into foreign markets, how we produce them here, how we prepare them here at home, and had our National Pork Board chef actually get up and talk to people about that and even gave everybody the recipes, and it was really just a great event. So for our perspective, that was an investment that was very well realized, got a lot of good press that came out of that, and one of which was an article that ran in Washington, D.C. with a quote from our Chief Executive Officer, Bill Even, that while the pork checkoff works to increase domestic consumption, as Secretary Perdue said today, free trade is truly the key to U.S. agriculture's success. I think that's really important, that we do everything we can to recognize that these trade issues that are being talked about are really going to be important because we're going to need to export our products to remain profitable. Because the last part of that quote I think is spot on. Pork industry is very dependent on the export market. And I think in a short period of time, we went from something where exports were a nice thing to have, a little added part to the bottom line, to something we're truly dependent upon. These are just some photos that came from the event and how well represented pork was at the World Meat Congress, which was outstanding. Amplifying our existing efforts, one of the greatest priorities we have for the year ahead is what we're calling Pork 2040. Other industries that are dependent on export spend a lot of time in what are called foresight studies to better understand the market for their products 20 years out. Nobody wants to be producing a buggy whip when Henry Ford is running Model Ts off the assembly line. That's what we need to have in the pork industry. No other livestock product has this level of foresight. We now need that. And so we're learning from the grain industry and some of those others that have invested heavily and understanding what the markets for their products are going to be like in that mid-future range, fully 20 years out. This is going to be a big deal for us, and it's going to be a big splash when we get it published, hopefully in 2020. And we want to make sure, again, that research, which is the reason the pork checkoff has the highest return on investment. We do good research, but then we apply that research and make sure that the industry knows what those findings are and what those markets will be. We're working right now to make sure that we leverage producer dollars as well as possible and getting some matching funds from USDA. We're looking at a number of different markets that today aren't really markets for us. The Indias, the Nigerias, frankly, the South Africas. And there's a list that actually the council provided us today of markets that we have limited or no access to that we're going to add into this study. We're going to make sure that we understand markets like in India, that Courtney's looking at, 300 million Christians that are at the low end of the economic ladder. And that's a country that doesn't have a very good cold chain. So right now it doesn't present a lot of opportunity for us, even if we work through the policy issues. Looking at long-term out, really scientifically, will their incomes increase and will those Christians actually want to eat some pork? The packing industry in India, for example, is overwhelmingly owned by the Muslim community. There's probably not going to be an interest in them processing pork domestically. The United States wants to be in a position that if you have willing consumers for pork, that we're in a position to provide it to them. In terms of budget, we're forecasting now it's going to be over $1 million project. But as I said, if we can get those USDA dollars and if we can use our partners with the U.S. Meat Export Federation, even the National Pork Producers Council through some in-kind salary matching, we're forecasting it to be about a $400,000 project in terms of checkoff dollars. So that $400,000 could go into a $1.2 million program is what we're working on now. Roadshow, as I said, one of our priorities this year is to meet with each individual packer and make sure what we're doing internationally meets their unique needs. I'm a part of that roadshow right now, making sure that we know what they need from us so that we're not working in a vacuum guessing where we should deploy our money. This has been a very valuable part for us. One of the things that we've heard clearly from them is work like a Pork 2040 project is valuable to them. Companies have a near-term need for a return on their investment. They have shareholders. They are looking at stock price. They're not going to invest a lot of money in a research project for 20 years out. They want a growth today. Certainly there's support for that. But we're also looking at other things that we can do up to and including a cutting yesterday that Courtney was a part of as well, where we did a comparison of U.S. versus Canadian product as shipped to Japan to look at some quality differences objectively. So again, to inform producers, these are some of the challenges we're facing in a very competitive and profitable market. 2019, where are we at? This year we had an $8.77 million international marketing budget. That was fully 10% over 2017. 2017 was 13% over 2016. So we've really been growing in our international marketing footprint. You look at where that $8.77 million went, overwhelmingly it went to the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Those are the boots on the ground in those 13 regions I talked about. 6.45 goes towards really promoting our products in those markets that we're in. We also invest heavily in the council and their American Pork Export Trading Company. That gives them the economic information that they need to understand the value of markets that we're not currently in. And they can use that economic information to obviously talk to the policymakers to make sure they understand the importance of us getting markets open to us. And then a number of other things in here that we're doing up to, including a partnership with Colombian pork producers, where we're working to promote generically pork in Colombia, because Colombia is a market where they've had a huge dietary pattern shift towards more pork consumption. Pork exports to Colombia are up some 56% last year. And we want to make sure that producers in that country don't view U.S. pork as a competitor, as a threat, that we're out there trying to damage a domestic industry. This is a true partnership. And so we're doing a lot of different things to make sure that the current markets we're in, we don't have risks to those as well. 2019, I think there's been a broad recognition by the International Marketing Committee that exports are going to be the sole issue that's going to keep this industry profitable during this period of expansion. Strong support for funding Pork 2040, strong support for funding the Council and Apex, strong support for funding and increasing funding to the U.S. Meat Export Federation. If you look back over the last 5 years, our funding in USMEF has been relatively flat. We have had growth in our USMEF funding, and this kind of shows the overall growth that we've experienced. On a percentage basis of the checkoff dollars, that means in the last 5 years we've gone from about 10.9% to about 14.4% of checkoff dollars going to international marketing. And as I said earlier, about 26.6% of U.S. production was exported last year. So that growth is really bringing things in line, frankly, with our dependence on international markets. 2019, the committee passed. Every committee is going to look at different things. Again, a pretty significant increase. The board is going to have to wrestle with this in terms of what they want to do with the overall National Pork Board budget. But clearly, there's a recognition by the committee that increased investment in international marketing is a priority for us. Where would that go in terms of USMEF? As I said, on the earlier slide, we put a lot of money into the Eastern Hemisphere. As you can see, where we see the really big pops from 18 to 19, and this just teases those out, is a lot more money in Central America, a lot more money in markets like South America, a lot more money in markets like Mexico. So really moving that money in line, frankly, with where our exports are going. Again, all of that is all about not putting our bacon in one basket, making sure that those markets like Honduras, Venezuela, the Caribbean, those that are experiencing huge growth are getting, frankly, our resources as well. And with that, I'll close and just make sure everybody remembers that it wasn't that long ago, 1994, that we were a net importer of pork. And today, this year, we could become the world's largest exporter of pork. It's a real testament to the industry, but one that requires your checkoff dollars to be used as strategically as possible. Dermot, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. His comment about Mother's Day really struck home for me. I was born in Ireland, and Mother's Day is about 2 months earlier there. And believe it or not, none of us would remember those days unless somebody reminded us. And so I don't get reminded. And every year, my brother, with whom there's still some sibling rivalry, calls me up. He's taken my mother out to lunch, and he calls me and tells me, "You forgot Mother's Day again." So, I do have an accent. I was born, I never lost the Irish accent. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about my real job, which is a teacher at Iowa State University. I'm very proud of being part of that program. Got a couple of students here, Courtney and Carter Lance, who are graduates of that. And some of you are young people, and if you're thinking about school, I highly recommend it. That's a 99% placement rate. My youngest daughter went there, and she had a zero work ethic when she began. And after hanging around with hardworking farm kids, she turned out okay. And if you're a livestock producer, you would be in the majority in any of our classes, so please give it some thought. Of course, the real purpose of that comment was to get you used to my accent. I hope you're all there now. I'm going to talk about the export outlook. There's been a lot of trade disputes at the moment. The experts with whom I interact with, who trade on the Chicago Board of Trade, do not expect these disputes to last into the fall because we have midterm elections, and there's a concern that if these disputes are still a problem, then that there will be a change, a political change. So I'm not going to focus as much on those. If I did, and they were all resolved a month from now, then I would have wasted your time. So I've got just one slide on those issues, but the rest of it will be, I think, a lot more positive. I'm going to begin with just data on exports from January to April. I just included the April numbers, so the March thing is a typo. The April numbers just came out. I'm going to talk about the economic fundamentals. I was in the room when pork producers on the National Pork Board came up with their target of 9% growth in exports every year, and I was comfortable when they did that, so I'll try and explain why there is room for optimism about U.S. pork. I'll talk about some positive market developments and some negative ones, and then some years exports are driven by demand from other countries. I think this year exports will be driven by a supply in the U.S., and I'll talk about why I think exports have to be strong this year just to get rid of some of the pork we're going to grow. And then the last slide will be trade policy concerns, but also opportunities. There's a lot going on right now, and it's possible that the U.S. could come out ahead at the end of all of these disputes. A little busy, I know, but just to talk about year to date. So this is comparing the first 4 months of this year against the first 4 months of last year. I typically include processed pork because if Hillshire Farms buys a pork product and sells it abroad, it has as much impact on U.S. pork prices as we export it out of line. So my data often doesn't line up with other economists. I also include variety meats. So this is everything we export from a pork perspective. We're up 4.32% using that basis. If I just did muscle meat, it would be up about 9%. Mexico came in with a huge month in April, 6.59. Japan has been disappointing, and I'll get back to that. China, of course, as Craig mentioned, they have low prices, which indicates high supply. South Korea, we just finally opened that market up completely free through U.S., and we're seeing some positive developments there. And moving down, you've got Australia up, the Philippines up, Dominican Republic at almost 20%, Honduras 11%, Chile, Guatemala, Taiwan, Panama. And you'll notice in this area here are countries to the south of us, and with many of those we have free trade agreements, so that will become relevant too. Okay, on to the economic fundamentals. I'm part of a benchmarking group. We meet with pork economists from other countries. We have these huge Excel files where we make them all comparable so that gilt is the same in every place. Carcass is weighed with the head on or the head off or adjusted, so that in the end we can accurately compare productivity and production costs. Prior to last year, the country with the lowest production cost was Mato Grosso in Brazil. And I was very surprised to see the U.S. is now the low-cost producer in the world because the Brazilian currency had fallen, so I had expected that they would become more competitive, but there must have been some other offsetting price increases. So the punchline here is that there's a significant cost advantage in the U.S. relative to Europe, and a modest cost advantage in the U.S. relative to Brazil and Canada. The file is available if you want it. It's a massive file because there are a lot more countries involved, but the punchline is that the U.S. is currently the low-cost pork producer. Without getting into detail, a lot of that has to do with the scale here, but also the fact that manure has value in the area where a lot of the pork in the U.S. is produced. And if you go to Flanders or Upper Saxony, or China, manure has a negative cost of upwards of $10 per annum. Now, the European producers are selling into a protected market, so just being the low-cost producer may not be enough. It might be that much of the European carcass is sold at a premium in the protected market, and then they can ship the bellies and ribs abroad because the break-even on those is low because they've gotten such a high price for everything else. So here I've got a comparison of live hog prices over time, and the U.S. is in blue, Canada is in red. And then the two exporting countries in Europe are Germany and Spain. And you can see that they do get higher prices, at least most of the time. Part of that is they are selling into a protected market, but also that they've had 2 phenomenal years in China, and so European pork producers have made money for 2 good years. So how do we rationalize this? Is being a low-cost producer enough? Well, one of the things we do is measure profitability of pork production from that same data. And don't worry about all the lines on the bottom. They're the competing countries. But the blue line on top is the net profit over time for all of those countries, with the U.S. being on top. So part of the reason we're having an expansion here is that we're the low-cost producer. That shows up in our live hog prices. Live hog prices are good, so we expand the industry. And that's the way economics should work. You have exports causing prices to be better than they should be, which in turn causes the expansion, which in turn allows us to continue to export. So that's the scenario we're in right now. And the question, of course, is, will this continue? Okay, still on the fundamentals. This is a piece of research I did over 30 years ago. I asked, was it more economical to take corn and soybeans and ship them on the river, across the ocean, and into a truck, and up to some farm in Japan or China, or just to take the pieces of the animal that those countries want and ship them out directly? And the punchline is it's far more economical to ship it out directly. For instance, the Chinese want the ends of the animals and the internal organs. They don't want the loins and the tenderloins. And so it's very expensive to ship corn and soybeans all the way to China, put it on a truck, haul it up a mountain, often in a bag rather than bulk, than it is to ship those pieces straight into Shanghai, into the wholesale markets. So if I'm right over those years, then that should have been borne out by the data. And what I've got on this chart are countries with whom we have some kind of a legally binding free trade agreement. So countries that have more or less reasonable access for the finished product, which is pork. And then on the I'm going to get rid of this. I don't think I need it. On the horizontal or the vertical axis is the percent of pork imported by those countries. And then you've got 1990 over here all the way to 2017. And these are the countries: Australia, Colombia, Honduras, Japan, Korea, Mexico, and New Zealand. And you can see that in most cases they start out importing nothing, with the exception of Japan. And then there's this run-up. When you open a market to free trade, what you end up getting is they import more of the pork product rather than the corn and soybeans. And so the fundamentals would be, as we open up markets, we're going to see more exports of the finished product rather than the raw materials. So the fundamentals are good. You open markets, they buy more meat, and when they look internationally for meat, they look at the U.S., and that creates an opportunity for us to be profitable. Okay, so that's now I'm going to talk about some developments in the last couple of years that at least came to my attention recently. Positive first and then negative. Craig alluded to this, but if you start in Mexico and go all the way down to Argentina, 10, 15 years ago, again, eating down there was like being on an airplane. It was beef or chicken, beef or chicken, beef or chicken. And pork just wasn't an option because trichina was an issue with backyard animals, and there's a brain-wasting disease called cystic cirrhosis. So basically only poor people ate pork, and pork was produced in unsanitary conditions. The beef down there is not at all good. It comes from, especially south of the equator, from these animals with the humps that look awful. You wouldn't, if you look at them, you wouldn't want to eat them. And even in Mexico, it's more or less shredded beef. This is not a good problem. So you're paying equivalent of $6 a pound for bad beef, or you can get a nice pork loin for $3 a pound. And so what's starting to happen in that part of the world is that beef consumption is falling and pork consumption is increasing. And it's a fundamental dietary realignment. I got interested in this because I kept asking myself the question, is this Mexico thing ever going to stop? I mean, they're increasing their imports by 10% a year. Will it ever stop? And the answer is there's a fundamental realignment of the dietary patterns south of the U.S. border, where pork is becoming a legitimate competitor. And as you can see in the case of Mexico, they now eat more pork than beef, and that, I bet, is a surprise to everybody. Same is true in Colombia. The red line is pork consumption. It was almost zero. This is funny because these are Spanish people whose national dish is chicharrones, and they weren't eating pork because it had a bad reputation. Pork consumption since the free trade agreement has skyrocketed, and so has chicken, but beef again is in a downward spiral. Now, how do you get people to realize that pork is healthy? You've got to tell them. And what the Colombians and with pork producer money, U.S. pork board money are doing is just telling people modern pork is a safe product. And I've always thought that $80,000 a year that Craig alluded to was a genius investment. And I compliment the producers who came up with that. And I think Peru is another opportunity to do the same thing. Okay, more continued good news. There's a dietary effect in the U.S. that we're all aware of. Let's call it the Atkins effect. But suddenly people are realizing that if you're worried about eating bad stuff, you should be concerned about sugar and carbohydrates. 10 years ago, they were concerned about eggs and meat. And that effect is influencing consumers in Asia and in the U.S. In Japan and Korea in particular, where suddenly seafood seafood used to be the meal of choice because it was healthy, and now suddenly they're willing to consider pork. So look at the top line. It's South Korean pork consumption in the period from 2012 to 2018. It went up by from 1.5 million to 2 million tons. So a 33% increase. That's because this pork healthy thing is taken over, and also because we have a complete free trade agreement as of this year with that country. Europe has a free trade agreement too, but they're lagging with their duties a couple of years behind us, and so our exports to South Korea have been huge. Now, it was frustrating for me to watch what would happen as those duties fell, because for several years the duty would fall, but pork prices at the retail level in South Korea were not falling. There was an importer cartel, and they were just absorbing a lot of the difference. And that importer cartel appears to be broken. And so suddenly we're seeing the real effect of the free trade agreement, because Korean consumers are starting to see pork at U.S. prices plus transportation costs. They've got a long ways to go before they're there, but at least the cartel is broken to the point where they're going to continue to see lower and lower pork prices and increase pork consumption. Okay, this is on to the bad news. As Craig mentioned, the Europeans were busy with China. China is not as big an importer as before. Brazil was busy with Russia. Russia kicked the Brazilians out, so now Brazil is in China, and so there's a buildup of European pork. This is after 2 years of positive profits. So this year, 2018, European pork production will be up by about 2%. 2%. Their consumers haven't got the Atkins diet yet, so their pork consumption is not growing. And so they're going to have more pork available on international markets, and we'll have to compete with them in some way. Okay, the Japan story. Our biggest market by far, but it's a market that is not price sensitive. I don't know if you've ever bought crop insurance, but all crop insurance agents have to sell the same product at the same price. So you don't compete on price, you compete on service, or you compete on other attributes, and that's why you're always getting gifts from your crop insurance agent. Canada and Spain have become export powerhouses, and they're in Japan competing with us, not necessarily on price, but on other attributes. And even though the top line is U.S., so our exports to Japan have been kind of disappointing. Canadian exports to Japan have grown. They're almost all chilled exports. And Canada has been going up to retailers and making a claim, whatever it is, about the quality of Canadian product, and then getting the retailers to switch from U.S. to Canadian product. So that's a huge concern. We don't know what the message is. I do know that the leadership of the pork industry in the U.S. is on that. That's what the cutting demonstration was yesterday. What is it the Canadians have that we need to start emulating? And then there's a blue line towards the bottom. That's Spain. Phenomenally growth in the pork industry near Barcelona in Spain. And they do sell a lot of the carcass into a protected French market, and they have pieces left over that are now available for the Japanese, in particular bellies. And because exports are their business, they're willing to make cuts and changes to the product to specifically suit that market. It's a vertically integrated industry. Spain, if you don't know, it has a huge unemployment problem. So they have very low wages. Their minimum wage is low. The people are willing to work long hours if they get a job. And so that's become a powerhouse. They can only export frozen product, but they're exporting, they went from 0 to 100,000 tons of frozen product, and that came at the expense of U.S. frozen exports too. So it's a market with demographic problems and also competitive problems, in large part because we can't take advantage of our cost of production advantage because it's got that minimum price floor on imported products. That could change with any kind of a agreement like TPP or a bilateral. We could get back into that market based on our competitiveness. But right now we have major competitor concerns. The other negative is China. The blue line are Chinese pork imports by year. For comparison, I put Japan and Mexico there. We all think of them as huge markets, but compared to China, they've been nothing. The general trend in Chinese pork imports is upwards. And there's actually a cycle in that, but it's so strongly upwards that you don't see that. Some years it's down and some years it's up. 2017 was a down year. Prices are low there now. Nobody really knows how much pork they're producing, but based on prices, it's not a major import market. The expectation among the people who watch that is that they will be at a minimum of about 2.5 million tons from now on, and then that will grow upwards when the hog cycle works, and then they'll come back. And so they're on that upward trend. But right now they do have that surplus that is pushing European pork all over the world against the interests of U.S. pork. Okay, the domestic situation. Beef this year is expected to be up almost 4%. Pork, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 4.6 and 5%. And broiler consumption will be enough to at 1.6 to get Americans to eat a little bit more broiler. And so the question is, where is that 4.6% more pork going to go? Can we consume it all here, or do we need to increase our exports? Now, before these trade policy concerns came, Craig asked me, well, what's going to happen to U.S. Pork exports this year? And I looked at that production number and I said, we're going to have to export at least half that. And roughly speaking, if you export 25% of your production and you had 10% growth, then you'd export an additional 2.5 percentage points. So that's where that number came from. The question is, who's going to eat the pork? I don't think Americans will eat that much pork, and therefore it's going to have to be exported. And the question is when. And again, we're looking past these trade policy issues right now. So first of all, when is it going to happen? Just look at 2018, and then you've got that's in the third panel down by quarter. And if you look over on the right-hand side, the big bulk of the expansion will be in the fourth quarter of this year. So that's kind of a typical thing. If we get more pork every fall just when we don't need it, and the question is, will it be exported or not? But as I said, even year to date on muscle meat, we're up about 9%. So we're on target if we're open to exporting a lot in the fall of this year. Okay, can the U.S. consumer handle that? This is U.S. pork consumption per capita. And we did have some down years. PED caused very high pork prices in the U.S., and so in 2014, pork consumption was low. And it's been building back up since then. And the key number is on the fourth row down in the box on the right. We're expecting U.S. consumers to buy 2.2% more pork. And so that does require us to look elsewhere for exports with the other half, which is where you get to a need to export 10% more. This is as of June 1, what the futures contract looks like. The 2017 futures is in blue, and then the red line is 2018. And you can see that because of expanded exports and, of course, because of these trade policy issues, pork prices are lower this year on the futures market than they were at the same time last year. I'm actually surprised that the fall prices are as strong as they are, given the growth we're coming at us. And if you expected these trade policy things to continue into the fall, then you would expect much, much lower prices. And so what's happening is people are discounting these trade issues and saying they'll be gone by the time the November midterms come around. This is a complex chart, but what it does is it tracks the pattern of the nearby futures over time in 2017 and compares it with 2018. And you can see what happened in April of this year. The April contract just closed down because that was just after the Chinese announcement. There was a major retrenchment in that contract, and people who waited to the end to deliver into that contract had a really tough time. But again, looking out, the fall contracts are not that different looking forward than they were for last year. And it's a puzzle unless you believe that the policy issues will be resolved. Okay, I've got a colleague, Lee Schultz, who has a model of the profitability of the pork industry. And that model assumes average productivity and that you sell all of your product at the cash price. Every producer is better than average. They all believe they're better than average, and they all believe that their contract is better than selling on the cash market. So this is a worst case situation. And you can see that over time, the U.S. pork industry has been profitable. That's those dark lines above. Now he's able to look forward with corn and soybean meal futures and with lean hog futures. And as he looks forwards, as of June 1 of this year, he's thinking that we're going to have some tough time over the next couple of years based on the futures prices. That's those red lines. And that's for a typical far-out-to-finish producer. It may be a worst-case scenario, but it's looking bad. And that's because prices have fallen over the last 3 months. If you're weaned to finish, things look even worse. I guess if you're weaned to finish, you'd need to stop paying so much for feeder pigs. So why are things so bad? It's not the packers. The packers used to make a lot more money than they are now. The green line is the packer margin, and they're suffering as much as anybody else. And I think the packer margins are falling because we have more capacity, more shackle space. Now, I did a talk at the Minnesota Pork Producers Conference in January of this year, did the same comparison, and that was the far-to-finish expected profitability. It was much, much greater. And so things have changed since January. I just heard Steve Meyer say that they were expecting in January to make about $30 on average over the course of this year. And this is for their better than average producer. Now that's back to $3. So things have changed. And of course, the reason is some of these trade issues. We had, before the trade issues emerged, we had the expectation that the U.S. would have preferential access in Vietnam and in Japan, but also there were countries like Indonesia and the Philippines that were lining up to participate that. So these free trade agreements in my lifetime have been like planes waiting to land at O'Hare. You get done with one of them, you start looking at the next. It was a beautiful sequence. We don't have any underway at the moment. We're not studying any free trade agreement at all. Instead, we're outside of these deals. Now, the European Union panicked when it saw that we were going to have better access than them in Japan, and so they rushed into effect a free trade agreement that is scheduled to be done by this time next year. I think the earliest possible date is January 2019. The first thing that will happen is they'll take duties of 20% on seasoned ground pork, which is really trimmings, and cut them from 20% to 10%. And so looking forward, unless that's resolved, we're going to be at an increase in disadvantage to European pork in that market, with a nearby effect relatively quickly on seasoned ground pork. I looked at the March numbers, and it used to be the seasoned ground pork was a big export from the U.S. and nothing from Europe. And now the March numbers showed a decline in our seasoned ground exports, with all these new countries showing up on the map. And I think what's happening is the Japanese importers are in Europe trying to teach them the specs for what they want, because we'll go from 20% to 10% in year one and then down to 0 after 4 more years. And so we're going to be facing a duty with one of our most important products in a market where other countries are not. And the funny thing is, the seasoned ground pork is the only thing that's price sensitive because it's treated differently. It isn't subject to the gate price, as is true with those other products. So that's bad. And of course, the TPP is going ahead without us. And Canada and Chile and Mexico can all provide pork into Vietnam and Japan, and if we're on the outside looking in, we're at a disadvantage there. You all know what happened on April Fools of this year. We have a 25% duty on U.S. pork. And you saw that recently Mexico has an NAFTA-related duty of 10%. Now, I'm an export guy, so when I look at what's happening, I'm like if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. And so as I look at the futures market over the last several months, I'll tell you what I think happened. This is February, March, so we'll take the March 1st. The expected price for July was $84 an animal. And then, if you look at around April 1st, we had this decline. The Chinese announced the duty, and then the market fell, and then the duty was imposed, and the market fell again. And so there's a thing called an event study where you can back out, okay, what did it cost us in terms of the change in the futures market just around the Chinese duty? The answer is about $9 per animal. That's the cost expressed over the course of a year. You multiply that by 127 million animals, you get a big number. And so I said $9 an animal is the cost, and I got some pushback from some people that said, no, if we knew about this Chinese duty as early as March. And so there's a report out there that says that if you include the change from March to the first week in April, the impact of that duty is even greater. The Mexican thing has been a puzzle for me. I thought the market would be down more than it is. I spent Tuesday night with a lot of commodity traders, and they're all convinced that Mexico duty is a short-term affair, and so it hasn't really impacted the market, except that there's some hurry-up buying right now to get hams bought before the 10% duty becomes a 20%. But if things stay in place, the punchline is we've exported 7 to 10% of our pork to Mexico because we have a competitive advantage because of free trade. Long run, if those barriers stay in place, other countries or Mexican consumers will begin providing that, and then we're going to have to downsize our industry. Okay, to finish on a positive note, the Chinese are tough people to deal with. There is at least a 12% duty on frozen. This is before the recent 25%, so we were always paying a duty on product going in, depending on whether it was fresh or frozen, and that was between 12 and 20%. Now China has announced it wants to buy more of our products, and I think they're serious. They're pragmatic people. They've got a $300 billion trade surplus with the U.S. I think that they might want to buy more of something, and there are environmental issues with the Chinese pork industry, and so it's possible that pork could come out of all this ahead. And they might make some change. One change could be to remove duties on imported pork, maybe from the U.S., maybe from somebody else. U.S. pays a duty of, an additional duty of 10%. It's called value-added tax. We're not familiar with it here. But if you've ever been to Europe on a holiday, when you're leaving, they always give you your value-added tax back at the airport. That's because everybody who exports a product upon which value-added tax has been charged gets the value-added tax when they export. And so European companies do have to pay the 10% duty on going into China, but they're getting the value-added tax back because they're exporting, because the VAT is a consumption-based tax rather than a production-based tax. So maybe we'll get the Chinese to take off the value-added tax on U.S. products because we're the only country that really pays it. They don't charge it on their own producers either. There's a thing called a minimum residue, minimum residue level that the international body like Codex has accepted. The Japanese accept that, the Koreans accept that, the Chinese do not. They want 0. So they might agree to take a minimum residue level. Back before this became an issue, our market share in China was over 50%, and now we're less than 20%, and so that could be a big deal as well. So something positive could come out of all this. I'm saying that because I wanted to finish on a positive note. Believe me, if I'd wanted to, I could have finished on a really negative note, but I'm kind of tired of all this stuff, so I thought I'd be positive. And who knows what's going to happen. The thinking is that July 15th we're going to impose these duties. That's supposed to, according to the Trump playbook, it's supposed to cause this big fight. And by July 15th we're supposed to be kissing each other again. So we'll see. Kind of like the North Korea thing. So I'll stop there.